Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Howden. I'm the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. I'm also a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And just sorting out my web system here, but no, it's not quite working. So anyway, today what I want to do is to give an information session on the forthcoming scoping meeting for the IPCC 7th Assessment Reports. That's the Working Group 1, 2 and 3 reports. Before I do that, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on who I stand, that's the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge their ongoing contribution to the life and culture of Australia. So just as a matter of protocol, people online, if you could just put your microphones on mute and just so everyone can hear. And what we'll be doing is recording this session. If anyone is concerned about having their voice and their face recorded, perhaps the best option is just to make sure your video is turned off if you're asking questions. So what I'll do in the first instance is to have a short presentation which covers some of the ground in relation to the IPCC, and then open that up for questions. And there's opportunities to put questions in chat, as well as just usual operation of putting your hand up to make sure that you're noticed in terms of questions. So I'll just share my screen and see how this goes. So hopefully that's a full screen there. So as I said, I'm just providing an information session. Now, the first point I'd make is that the role of the IPCC is different from many other things we engage in as part of the science and research communities. The idea of the IPCC is to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the scientific and social and technical information relevant to understanding climate change and actions to deal with climate change. There's a real focus within the IPCC that IPCC reports should be policy informing, not policy prescriptive. So we don't use language such as governments should do this or should do that. What we're actually trying to do is convey the best information of the science with particular courses of action in some cases, with the consequence of those courses of action, without actually coming to judgment as to which is the best course, because that is the business of the governments. And the governments run the IPCC. So the intergovernmental part of that tells you that it's actually, the IPCC is fundamentally an organisation owned by the governments, but essentially serviced by this research community. So when we're thinking about that, it's actually an example of science policy working together. And in fact, it's probably the single biggest science policy experiment in the history of humankind. When you actually look at the scale of the activity, the longevity of the activity, and the numbers of people who are involved in it, right across the board, from governments through to the science community, through to the technical support units, it's an extraordinarily large activity. And this activity is there to provide rigorous, balanced and good scientific information on climate change. The basic structure of this, to stitch that policy and science together, is there's working groups. Working Group 1, which deals with the physical science, the climate science. Working Group 2, which deals with impacts, adaptation, vulnerability. Working Group 3, which deals with emission reductions. And there's also a task force on greenhouse gas inventories. And all of these pieces of the puzzle ideally work together, and increasingly over time we've seen overlaps between these different elements. So we see Working Group 1 linking in with Working Group 3, for example, on climate change scenarios and greenhouse gas emission scenarios. If we look at the history of the IPCC, there's been 6 assessment report cycles previously, 14 special reports. The one that's on the boil at the moment is the special reports on cities. We had the scoping meeting just a few weeks ago in Latvia. There's been a series of guidelines being produced, and there's been other products as well relating to technical papers, expert work meeting products and similar things. To give you a feel for the timelines over which the 7th assessment cycle will operate, we've passed this point where we've had the initial meetings in terms of defining what the structure is and some of the timings of products from the IPCC, but that hasn't been finalised. What has been finalised is the special report on climate change in cities, which I've already mentioned, the methodological report on short-lived climate forces, and a methodology report on carbon dioxide removal technologies. So all of those are intended to be delivered before the end of 2027. The main assessment reports, Working Group 1, 2 and 3, including the update on the 1994 Technical Adaptation Guidelines, which will be part of Working Group 2, are yet to be confirmed in terms of their delivery date. But there's a hope, by some at least, some governments, that it will be delivered before the global stocktake, the second global stocktake, towards the end of 2028. Subsequent to that, there's a synthesis report which has its own set of processes, its own scoping processes as well. So what we're dealing with today is largely this column here, which is the 7th assessment report and the update on technical guidelines, and having a scoping meeting covering that. Now, when we look at the 6th assessment report, every cycle we go through the IPCC, we essentially do a lessons learnt process. You know, what are the things that we look to improve in the next cycle? And some of the key messages from that lessons learnt process are on the screen here. So importantly, the discussions and the lessons relate to, amongst other things, the brevity and clarity of the reports for the purpose that they're intended, which is to inform climate change action. We also see discussions about evaluation of different report formats that are more fit for purpose, and the need for new product types. We also saw a recognition that we need to have more expert meetings and workshops to fill the gaps that may not be adequately dealt with by the assessment reports and other products themselves. A very strong message about authorship and diversity of authorship on the IPCC reports to ensure that we get the adequate range of voices coming into play, and particularly discussions on First Nations voices, so Indigenous peoples, and getting that Indigenous knowledge more adequately represented in the IPCC reports, as well as traditional and local knowledge better represented. And that's a challenge, given that these voices are often not adequately covered within our the research literature that the IPCC draws from. We also saw a series of issues to do with recognised in terms of data access and data management, and that's particularly the purview of the task group on data. And the important thing here is that so information which is needed by the assessment report process is accessible and available to them, and also that information and the outputs from those analyses are archived effectively. When we look at the emphasis in the 7th assessment cycle, it's in those little tiles on the right-hand side. So when the discussion was happening at the plenary, where the governments, the focus continues to be the IPCC should produce robust, comprehensive, accurate, inclusive reports, but also, as I mentioned before, that they use diverse literature and knowledge sources, including Indigenous people's knowledge and local knowledge. And so when we look at, the sort of set of expertise that's listed as an indicative list of expertise in that URL that's on the bottom of your screen, which is on the IPCC website. So you can go in there and look at the indicative list of expertise for Working Group 1, 2 and 3, and also importantly for those cross-cutting elements that cross-cut between the working groups and between the working groups and the Task Force Bureau of Inventories. Now, if we look at the assessment report process across the IPCC, where we're up to, this is a generic sort of process rather than one specific to the AR7. But if we start at the top left, we have the scoping meeting, which develops an outline, a draft outline, pulled together by the research community and others who engage in that scoping meeting. That outline then goes to the plenary, the government meeting, to get approved, and for the timelines and length of the outline to also be approved. There's a process then for the assessment reports where there's nomination of authors. So you put your hand up to become an author. There's a selection process, which is often quite complex in terms of pulling together the author teams. There's multiple drafts. There's the first order draft, which then gets expert reviewed, government and expert review. A second order draft, which is similar, has review. And then the final draft, which has government review. Then there's an approval and acceptance process, which is again a governmental process, and then publication down the bottom. So that's the broad cycle. To address this particular topic today, what is a scoping meeting? So I've talked briefly about this, but a scoping meeting effectively identifies the structure of the following assessment reports. So how is it structured in terms of, say, chapter headings and the number of chapters and how they link together. Then it also identifies chapter material in a series of dot points below those headings. And it also identifies indicative lengths, and they come together in an indicative or draft outline, which then goes to the governmental approval process. And there is often some degree of negotiation in that approval process. These scoping meetings, that process of working through what these reports should look like, are an integral and essential part of the assessment report preparation process. So it's something which is taken very seriously, and governments look to the research community to do a really good job on this. The aim of this scoping meeting we're talking about today is to develop the proposal for the structure and content of the 3 7th Assessment Report Working Group reports. That's Working Group 1, 2, and 3, including the update for the adaptation guidelines. That will, as I said, then be looked to be approved. Now, scoping meeting participants, to adequately feed into that process, often need a broad understanding of climate change and related issues. So in selection, there's both depth and breadth that is valued in terms of scoping meeting participants. So we want people at those meetings who can talk very coherently about some of the specific areas of research, but also stitch that research into a broader picture, so that when we come out at the end of the scoping meeting, what we have is a comprehensive and integrated outline. And in doing that, we need to have a careful balance between different things. So for a scoping meeting report, it can't be too vague, because then governments will argue about the detail, and that can be taken extraordinarily long time. And it can't at the same time be too prescriptive, because that locks in and limits the options for authors during the writing process. So the scoping meeting itself is required to have a fair degree of insight into the subsequent processes that are used to approve it and then carry through into the publication process. Now, in terms of this, the sort of scoping meeting timetables and the sets of itemized processes here, we have a call for scoping meeting participants at the start. So that's happened already, and that call here in Australia closes on the 24th of May with applications due into DQ. The web address for that to submit those is the IPCC focal point, one down the bottom right-hand side. So the process for nomination is done by governments. So it's not a direct nomination. You don't throw your hat in the ring directly into the IPCC. You throw that hat into the government ring, and then they pass on to the IPCC those nominations. Nominations can be also made by observer organisations, so registered observer organisations. Subsequent to that, in July or around about July, there's expected to be a selection of scoping meeting participants by the IPCC Bureau, so people like me and other vice chairs and the chair, and also the technical support units. So in that scoping process and selection process, it's quite a complex one because there's a need to reconcile several different dimensions in terms of coverage by the individuals who are chosen. So obviously there's an element of having the appropriate expertise. So that's that combination of depth and breadth that's needed. But also increasingly in this particular process, we need to have that Indigenous and traditional local knowledge coverage. There's also a dimension which is ensuring as best as possible gender balance, but also balance between developing and developed countries. There's also a need for balance across different regions so that some regions aren't overrepresented versus other regions. So our region here in Australia is the Southwest Pacific region, and so we need to have coverage across those different regions. There's also an element of choosing both experienced IPCC people, but also new people who are new to IPCC and can bring in different ideas into the fray. There's also some other sort of criteria which are used. So, you know, in relation to just balance of author teams in terms of, you know, approaches to the topics. And that includes things like addressing cross-cutting issues and demonstrated capability or record of doing that. So when we're selecting, often it's an incredibly competitive process. So for the IPCC Cities report, there was over 1,300 nominations for around about 85 people chosen. So it's a very hotly contested space in which you're throwing your hat into. That scoping meeting participants then develop the draft outline, as I've talked about, and then that process is run by the technical support units from the different working groups, but also the people from the IPCC Bureau like myself. And an indicative time for that is December of next year after the COP. This still has to be approved by the plenary, by the governments, because they might get a bit upset if it's too close to the COP. So if it happens, I suspect it will be the second or third week of December this year. And then, as I mentioned before, if that does happen in December, it goes to approval process and negotiation process early in 2025. And then there can be the identification of those authors and the start of the writing, the zero order draft. Now, if you're one of the people who put your hat in the ring but don't get accepted for the scoping meeting process, there are many, many other roles that you can play in the IPCC, and I've listed those here. So obviously there's the scoping meeting participants that I mentioned, but there's not just the assessment reports, but there's also the synthesis report later. We have the assessment report and special report author teams, which consist of coordinating lead authors, so they're in charge of chapters, lead authors who are in charge of writing specific blocks of text, contributing authors who are in charge of writing very specific parts of the text, chapter scientists who are there to support the author team, and review editors who are there to look at quality control. There's a synthesis report writing team, which has characteristics of the above writing teams, but having a separate selection process. There's also roles in terms of being an expert reviewer of the IPCC products, so that we have people throwing their knowledge into the process to improve the drafts. And there's inventory methodology reports contributors as well, where we're likely to run expert meetings. So for example, there'll be an expert meeting on reconciling the top-down and bottom-up greenhouse gas inventory or carbon budgets. There's opportunities to participate in those. There's opportunities if you're a member of a government to be a government representative. There's also observer organisation representatives, so a whole range of different organisations come to IPCC meetings. There's opportunities to be a bureau member, so put your hand up for the next IPCC elections, or to be employed by the technical support units or secretariats, where you get your hands really dirty with IPCC matters. And the last item right down the bottom is really important, that you can have a role in the IPCC through doing your own research and publication of that research, because IPCC assessments are only as good as the scientific and research literature available to be drawn from. So if you're an author and you're looking at having a paper which is specifically targeted to be suited for the next IPCC assessment, look out for various cutoff dates for literature. So there's a cutoff date which, if your paper hasn't been submitted, it can't go into the report, and there's a cutoff date if your paper hasn't been accepted, it can't go into the report. So keeping an eye on those cutoff dates might be useful in the future. Now, I'll just finish that off there, but happy to answer any questions. So, any questions there?
So Mark, if we are interested in nominating, Shell Lyons here, sorry.
Sure.
If we are interested in nominating, what do you need to send through to DECU, to the focal point? Are there guidelines on that?
Yep. So, so there's sort of strict formats. So DQ can provide that with you. So there's essentially like a spreadsheet type item where you put in your best publications, your areas of expertise, what sort of role you want, what area of you might be able to contribute to, and essentially a CV type approach there. But there's a very standardized set of elements. And I thought Sean had sent something around the other day. Sean Hart had sent something in an email. So just check your emails from Sean.
I've seen that. Okay, thank you.
And to respond to one of the questions in the chat, both the recording and the PowerPoint will be available off the ICED's website. Any other online questions?
Hi, there is one I have just posted on the chat box. If you could answer, please.
Yeah, so there's two here, one from Nathan Bindoff, which is why are there so few special reports? So there's significant discussion amongst governments as to the structure of this cycle. And one of the considerations was ensuring, from some governments, was ensuring that the reports would be delivered before the second stock take. Now, given the second global stock take in 2028, now given that we've already committed to one special report, that's the special report on cities, if we were to deliver in that shorter timeframe or fairly compact timeframe, there essentially wasn't space for another special report. And so last time around, AR6, there were 3 special reports: the 1.5 degrees report, the land report, and the oceans report. And that essentially overloaded the system. So overloaded both the technical support units and the author community. The question about 4-page nominations, including a CV, is being short. Look, it's a level playing field. Everyone has the same form. I would suggest that you should be able to make a good representation of your skill base and the reasons why you should be chosen within that 4 pages. Everyone else will be operating off the same constraints. So I just say run with it. If you think about the selection process, it would not surprise me that we'd get 3,500 or perhaps more nominations. If you've got 20-page CVs, you just think about the task of selection. There's a good rationale for keeping the applications short.
Okay, Mark, can I ask something?
Sorry?
Yeah, I want to ask, could you please provide this presentation slides so we can look the information, because when presenting it's running very quick, and if we get the presentation slide, then we can look it again and then prepare our nomination application so far.
I didn't pick all of that up, but I think, yes, we'll be putting the slides up on the...
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, as I said.
And then about that 4 pages on, so there is require any publication or just number of publications or like link, that should be fine, because as you mentioned, someone put 30 pages CV and who can read, then reviewer has not enough time, that I understand, but as short and succinct should be.
So there's an IPCC process of the 4 pages, the design template, so we're not in a position to change that. There's also the IPCC's deadline, which is 7th of June for nomination submissions, and the Australian focal point will be collating those submissions and sending them in. That's why there's an earlier date for the Australian process. So my suggestion would be just to, if you want to engage, just accept that those dates are real and that the template is necessarily short, and run with that. There's a so if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up on the screen, but otherwise I'll continue to go down the chat items. So there's an item which just says, can local government or public servants be nominated? There's no constraint there from a point of view of IPCC. That's probably something to discuss with the supervisors and your organisations. But my, there have been people from local governments who have taken a range of roles in the IPCC, including last time round, one of the co-chairs of Working Group 2 was from a local government in Africa. So I don't think there's any fundamental constraint there from an IPCC point of view. It's much more your local area to make sure that you've got the support there. Nathan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Some of my staff have actually asked me whether they should apply for the nominate for the scoping meeting, or should they wait and nominate for the Working Group 1 or 2 or 3 round. So the question to you is, what advice would you provide them that I can tell them or reflect back to them?
I'd say that the selection processes are largely independent. And so I wouldn't necessarily think keeping your powder dry was a way of thinking about it. And in fact, that if you are at the scoping meeting, I guess you become a known quantity to the IPCC Bureau and others, and that may help with a sort of a subsequent selection. But I think that's very much on the margins. That the selection processes are classically done on the basis of what's in front of the selection panel, which constitutes the bureau members. So I would, if people are interested in throwing their hat in the ring, I'd say just do it, and don't sort of think that's going to compromise your later chances of being an author on the main assessment.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. So just going back to the sort of questions, yes, we can work with DQ to send the nomination form around again, so that's all fine. How many people are involved in the scoping meeting, and do these things happen together or separate, and have I been involved in scoping meetings before? Okay, I'll go from the bottom. Yes, I've been involved in several scoping meetings over the years, some for Working Group 2, some for synthesis reports, and some for special reports. They're all sort of different. but they all engage the people there in various formats of group discussion. Things that we're all fairly familiar with about working through brainstorming topics, filtering them out, clustering them, pulling them together to get a coherent whole. How many people are involved? So in the scoping meetings we're likely to see, we're probably going to be up in the sort of, I think roughly 180 per working group, which might be, but some of those will be technical support unit people, some of them will be bureau members and things. So I think we're probably looking at in the low, a bit more than 100 researchers. There will be both people there who are sort of largely focusing on the working group specifics, so working group 2 or working group 1, but there will also be a cohort who are sort of cross-cutting and focusing on cross-cutting issues. So how does working group 2 interact with working group 3, and what are the topics and what are the modes of integration that can happen there? So common chapters, common boxes, common analysis, and similar things. So there's an element of expected crossover between working group 1, 2, and 3, as well as a set of processes which are establishing very good outlines for each of the working groups. So yes, there's both a degree of independence, but also there's a degree of codependence across those different elements. So going down to Hannah's question, which is these cycles are long. To her advice for ECRs, and given the publications and CV-based application, advanced career academics are more competitive. Okay, yes, they are considerable length. If we're looking at the whole of this working group assessment cycle, we're finishing in 2028, depending on working group, early to late 2028, if the current timetable gets approved, then it is a long-term commitment, but it's very spiky. So IPCC processes tend to have short periods of very significant activity and then long periods of largely inactive sort of elements. And so from a researcher's point of view, the spiky activity is where you're undertaking the writing and bringing in review comments and things. The quiet times are where governments and others are doing the review, and so there's not much to do at that point except perhaps collect more information and do more analysis. So so it is a considerable, if you both are successful in the scoping meeting nomination and as an author, it is multiple years of commitment and not an inconsiderable allocation of time needed to make. So if you're an early career researcher, by the time you finish this, you actually might be a mid-career researcher, and so some people have actually said to me, an IPCC role isn't a normal role; it's actually like a jail sentence, and because it does go over multiple years. So I think that's part of the consideration. How do you think about an IPCC role in terms of multi-year commitments? I would highly recommend people who are ECRs who have an interest in an entity like the IPCC to put your hand up. You meet really interesting people with really great research backgrounds. There's in the better operating author teams, not all author teams operate as well as others, but in the better author teams, it's an incredibly uplifting and motivating experience, and one that can set you up for your later career, because you'll establish really good networks, you'll establish a reputation for delivering, you'll understand much more effectively the science policy interface. So I would be very recommending ECRs and mid-career researchers getting involved. Does your state, in terms of your CV, etc., matter? No, as long as the CV shows evidence that you are doing work that can contribute to the IPCC. So I mentioned before some of the criteria were people who are new to IPCC, as well as people who are experienced in IPCC, and in part of that cohort, of the people who are new to IPCC, we want to bring in young researchers as well as more experienced researchers. So that diversity, I'm actively looking for that diversity as part of the selection process.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate that. Cheers.
Thanks, Hannah. We've got Maria on the online.
Hi, thanks, Professor Howden. I'm just building on some of the conversations that we're having now, especially for ECRs, but I wanted to also pick up on the points you raised, that there's a need to diversify the different expertise and disciplinary backgrounds. When it all comes down to the selection, how does that kind of how does that look like in practice in terms of thinking about the gender representation, ECR, and then also discipline, perhaps particularly in arts, humanities, or social sciences? How can, how does this look like in practice? And then what would your advice be specific to perhaps more on the social sciences as well? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. That's a great question. And so if we go back several cycles, I think it's probably fair to say that the focus of the IPCC was very biophysical in its nature, and that includes the sort of economic elements. And I see David online, and he'd probably complain bitterly about me characterizing it like that. But these days, it's much more inclusive, much more diverse. People who are social psychologists or historians have roles in the IPCC. So I think you don't apologize for your expertise. I think what you do is you put your best foot forward. You actually say, these are the things that I'm really good at and have expertise. This is how it could contribute to the IPCC. So I wouldn't be at all apologetic. I think as long as there's an obvious contribution that you can make to the IPCC, I think you should put your hand up. We need many different types of expertise. We need many different voices to deal with complex issues like climate change.
Thank you.
Just moving down, so I think there's some comments sitting from Nathan. Yes, different roles. So we're talking about the scoping meeting. So the scoping meeting is a very specific process. It's a one-off. It's not a continuing sort of role, and it involves multiple days, 3 or 4 days, where you lob into there, you do your thing, and then you move back to your day job. And so it's very different from an author role, which is a continuing role, which you go to meetings, you engage with other people, you go and rewrite your information, and then the cycle goes around again, sort of thing. So focusing on the scoping meeting, it's a very very specific, very time limited activity. Perhaps a little bit of pre-scoping meeting work, looking at videos, getting up to speed with processes and content. But then once the outline's done, that's the job. If you're thinking about the scoping meeting, because I see some, authors, an author role, that's in the main assessment once the scoping has been done, then it's a completely separate selection process, and it's a fundamentally different role once you're in that author role. So important to, in this discussion, particularly focusing on the scoping meeting, it's a one-off short-term thing. Subsequently, that, as I mentioned before, if you put your hat in the ring on the scoping meeting or don't put a hat in the ring on the scoping meeting, it should have very little to do with your success or otherwise as a subsequent author. And so there's a couple of questions there. Advice for researchers, going back to what I've said before, is that in terms of this scoping meeting, if you want to put your hat in the ring or put your hand up for this scoping meeting, do so. But noting that you're probably going to be competing with a large number of other people who are similarly putting their hand up, and so you have to just make your own assessment of time inputs and alternatives to putting your hand up. So there's a message from Sean Hart on just contact him at that email, IPCC focal point at dq.gov.au. Thanks, Sean, for putting that into there, and I suspect from the look of the chat, you'll be getting plenty of questions. Just again, no hands up. Yeah, so comments about sort of young people on author teams, and I have to say that many of the young people on author teams seriously outperform their older colleagues, so just because you're young doesn't mean you can't make an oversized contribution to the IPCC. So Sean is going to circulate those forms for anyone who wants them, and down the bottom from Christine, there's a question: are there any avenues where PhD students who'd like to be involved can contribute? The answer is yes, and so there's a very specific role for PhD students and similar, and that's called a chapter scientist. So the process for selecting authors goes through a similar process for selecting this scoping meeting participants, and so it's through the IPCC with selection from the IPCC Bureau in a fairly formal process. There's another role though, which is a separate role, and that's called a chapter scientist role. So chapter scientist roles essentially specifically designed for PhD students. So chapter scientists, ECRs who engage to do some of the legwork in terms of support of the authors. And I'm just being blunt, in terms of the role. So it's things like cross-checking references, cross-checking numbers in tables, so you don't get 3,000 instead of 300 in a table and then cause a furore. So there's engagement at that level. Now, in past times, some of the chapter scientists have made such significant contributions that their level of engagement, or their input has been recognised by essentially reclassifying them as authors or contributing authors. And so sometimes becoming a chapter scientist can actually be a route to getting authorship on IPCC reports. So and it's a separate, as I said, a separate process, which there'll be sort of some call for chapter scientists. And the reason why I'm a little vague on that is because, not because I'm vague about it, but because the process is still evolving as to how chapter scientists are chosen, what the criteria are and what the process is. So in the past, it's been pretty ad hoc, and we're just regularizing that at the moment. So hopefully, Christine, I've answered that one. There are specific roles there for PhD students. Just noting the time, just keeping on going. Question about online convening. So what we're anticipating is, as you'd expect, that we'd sort of have a combination of online and physical meetings for the the main assessments, but the scoping meeting is essentially physical, so it's in person, and the scoping meetings tend to be incredibly interactive, both on an individual to individual basis as well as part of group processes, and I think trying to fit everything into a very small time slice virtually would be very difficult. And so scoping meetings in person, assessment report subsequently is going to be a combination. So it's some in person, some online, some hybrid. And of course, there's a key driver for having virtual meetings, which is just to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of the IPCC. And that's one of the lessons learnt. You know, we've focused on finding ways to reduce that footprint. Yep, so Pandora's just saying they had a historian last time round. In fact, there were several historians last time round. Yeah, and then just a comment on expert review. And so, yeah, PhD students, of course, along with others, can act as expert reviewers on IPCC. So typically, if I was going to be an expert reviewer, you have to put your name hat in the ring. So there's a sort of quality control filter, so that you don't get problematic people becoming expert reviewers. But once that happens, you can download, you know, chapters or whatever. If I was an early career researcher, I wouldn't try to expert review a whole chapter. I'd take a slab of that, which was consistent with your own area of expertise, and then make some really good comments on that. And that would be extraordinarily helpful, I think, for the IPCC process. So at this stage, one last call for hands up. So moving away from the chat. Okay, well, just before I close off, I see Jackie and Pandora and various other people who have IPCC experience. Is there anything that I've missed or misrepresented? Nathan as well, feel free to. Okay, thumbs up from Jackie. That'll do me.
I think you've covered it.
Fantastic. Okay, well, in that case, any further questions, feel free to get in touch with me from a point of view of my role as a vice chair, or get in touch with Sean, particularly in relation to the process for nomination for various forms and similar things. And Sean's here on the call, and so I'll be quite aware of the conversations we've had today. But I want to thank everyone for participating, and I hope you have a great afternoon.